Love, Lust, and Geology in Northern Ontario, a first novel. Chapter 1. Wolverine. As she surveyed her surroundings, she wondered just what it was that Chris and Phil had against the place, the Bear Paw. True, the bar did appear to be housed in a barn, but then what did one expect in the wilds of Northern Ontario? A downtown club? She herself would have preferred to save her R&R till her day off tomorrow, but an evening alone with Grant would have been insupportable. She could never have imagined, when she'd chosen him as her PhD supervisor, that the friendly and charming man, albeit somewhat inept lecturer, whose classes she'd attended for the past year, would transform into a childish, self-absorbed, insensitive, impatient control freak, a Dr. Jekyll in the university setting, and a Mr. Hyde in the field. They were only 2 weeks into their field work, and already the two boys had been on the brink of an altercation with him. Grant had supervised countless graduate students. She had met several of his older students, who now held senior positions at the Ontario Geological Survey, and all had shown a fondness for Grant. Granted, they had also joked about his idiosyncrasies, but in academia, being considered odd was almost a prerequisite to being recognized as brilliant. The most brilliant professors were inevitably oddballs. She just couldn't understand how his students could have spent months with him in the field and still maintained such a congenial relationship with him. As she mulled over the next stage of their field work, her eyes were drawn to a boisterous group of men who were just cascading in through the door. They were of varying ages and shapes, or rather girths, but one trait they all had in common was that they were uniformly tall. One in particular stood out like a beacon from the rest. He was handsome to the point of being beautiful. As she regarded him from a distance, it occurred to her that he might well be the handsomest man that she had ever met. Not that she had met him, or was likely to. And there was another thing about him. He looked oddly familiar. She couldn't immediately put her finger on it, but then it struck her. She had never been one for actors and actresses. She considered it a huge waste of time. But there was one actor for whom she had a decided weakness. Perhaps it was because she had grown up reading comics, Marvel comics. The actor was Hugh Jackman, and the man in her sights was the closest living facsimile of Jackman that she had ever seen. If truth be told, he was even handsomer, possessing larger eyes and fuller lips than Jackman, and the resemblance wasn't confined to his face. Even his height and build were similar, though he was leaner, not as bulky and muscle-bound as Jackman had been when he played Wolverine. She hadn't known what to expect during her field season, but one thing she had certainly not expected was encountering Wolverine in Northern Ontario. It added an exciting dimension to her stay. The excitement, however, was to be limited to her imagination. She didn't expect to actually speak to the man. However, she could easily envision conjuring him up as she lay down to sleep in the cabin. Currently, that time was reserved for cataloging grievances she'd accumulated against Grant over the course of the day. She watched the group with interest, and Wolverine in particular. She had intended to call it an early evening, staying out just till Grant could be relied on to be asleep, but was now prepared to extend her stay. She noted the easy familiarity with which members of the group interacted with the waitress, and with others seated at nearby tables. Unlike her, they were definitely locals. Several pitchers of beer arrived at their table. Wolverine was soon chatting with a woman at the next table. The woman was a pretty redhead and couldn't seem to help smiling and laughing frequently, obviously pleased with Wolverine's attentions. She saw Wolverine consume a glass of beer. After he had finished another, he stood up and held his hand out to the woman. She took it and stood up, smoothing her dress, which was a flaming red color, not unlike her hair. By her own taste, the dress appeared too constricting. However, it outlined the redhead's attractive figure to a T, which was presumably its purpose. They walked hand in hand towards the dance floor. Their route lay directly past her table. She kept her eyes glued to Wolverine. He was laughing and joking with the woman. It didn't occur to her that he might actually notice her watching him. But as he walked by her table, her staring must have caught his attention, because his gaze shifted from the woman to her, and the corners of his mouth curved up into a slight smile. She immediately lowered her eyes, focusing on her beer, but feared that in that fraction of a second they may have conveyed far more than she liked. Best to stick to her original plan of calling it an early evening, she decided. As she sat gazing at her beer, her mind very much elsewhere, she willed herself not to look at him, but found her eyes constantly wandering. She watched him surreptitiously, allowing herself brief glances in his direction. True to his moniker, he was well coordinated, a good dancer. An eclectic mix of songs played, pop, rock, and country, plenty of country, but they all shared a common characteristic. They were up-tempo, but then the tempo changed. A slow song began to play. Wolverine and the woman smiled at each other. He stepped towards her, and his arms circled her waist, while her hands rose up to rest on his shoulders. They spoke a few words to each other, and then he pulled her in close against him. Her arms wound round his neck, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes. They swayed rhythmically to the music, his hand stroking her back. When the song ended, they separated. Holding both her hands in his, he leaned down and said something to her. She smiled and nodded. Then, releasing one hand, he walked her back to her table. They resumed their former seats and continued to talk in a friendly manner. She found herself again staring, entranced. She decided that there was something else that she liked about him, and that was the expression of good humor on his face. He would need some serious acting chops to mimic the brooding persona of Wolverine. It would definitely not be a natural fit. He appeared engrossed in his conversation with the woman, but as had happened earlier, his eyes unexpectedly flitted from the woman to her, and he caught her looking at him again. Her beer was again the immediate recipient of her attention. Never in her life had it been such an object of interest to her. Feeling deeply embarrassed, she cursed herself for not learning her lesson the first time. All right, now she really had to go, and if the light happened to be on in Grant's room when she arrived back at the cabin, then she would simply wait in the truck till it went out. She began to sip her beer quickly, intent on finishing it before she left. From her peripheral vision, and that was the only part which still possessed her permission to regard him, she saw Wolverine get up from his table and amble in her direction. She assumed that he was headed towards the dance floor, and wondered why he hadn't bothered to bring his partner along. The closer he got, the lower went her gaze, until finally she was reduced to following the progress of the bottom of his shirt, his belt, and his jeans. As they all three reached a point directly opposite her, they alarmingly came to a halt and rotated in her direction. She glanced up, beset by a terrible case of nerves, her heart pounding. Wolverine placed his hands on the back of the chair that was across the table from her and leaned forward. A view of him at such proximity did nothing to dispel her earlier opinion of his looks. Indeed, it confirmed it. She saw that his eyes were very light, hazel, and fringed by dark lashes, very attractive, and the same smile that she had seen earlier was playing across his lips. "Do you mind if I sit down?" She was struck by how deep and resonant his voice was. She glanced nervously at him. "No, go ahead." He pulled out the chair he'd been leaning on and sat down. "Hi, my name's Tom," he said, extending his hand across the table. "Samina," she murmured, taking it. She noted how large his hand was compared to hers. It felt warm and slightly rough as it closed around hers in a firm grip, but a quick glance at it revealed that there were no openings for retractable adamantium claws. That was good. But then, didn't the claws actually slice their way through Wolverine's skin each time they emerged? Not quite as good. "Samina, that's a nice name. Are you from the reserve?" "What? I haven't seen you around here. Are you from the reserve?" "You think I'm native?" she asked with a nervous giggle. "No, I was actually born in India." "India? Oh, but I live in Toronto." "Toronto." There it was, the same disparaging tone with which just about every local uttered that name. "What are you doing here?" "I'm studying your rock," she replied, taking a sip of beer to moisten her dry mouth, another symptom of the state of her nerves. His smile disappeared, and his eyes widened. He glanced about, and then he leaned towards her and whispered conspiratorially, "You know, I think that's the most forward thing a woman's ever said to me. But I like it," he declared, sitting back with a huge Cheshire cat-like grin overspreading his face. She took one look at him and burst out laughing. She hadn't fully swallowed the sip of beer she'd taken, and some of it sprayed out. No, no, she choked out between fits of giggling. I mean real rocks, as in geology. Oh, he joined in laughing, looking somewhat sheepish. Sorry. So you're a geologist, he remarked, regaining his composure as she still struggled to suppress some remnant giggles. Yes, I'm doing my PhD in geology. What are you studying? She scrutinized him for a moment, trying to decide if she should give him the short version or the long version. Better stick to the short version. Wolverine wasn't exactly known for his braininess. A melting event that occurred about 2.7 billion years ago, the biggest one that we know about. There's evidence that the middle of the crust extended or stretched during the event. I'm trying to figure out by how much. Billion, he exclaimed. Yes, you have some very old rocks here, though not the oldest. That sounds really interesting. Does it? She asked skeptically. Yeah, so how are you planning to figure that out? She looked at him closely. Had he just asked a question, a pertinent question? Was it possible that a brain, a good one, was paired with that stunning face? She went on to explain that she would be measuring dikes, which were sheets of molten rock which invaded existing rock, and trying to come up with a way to estimate the amount of extension that would be needed to accommodate the dikes. Oh, he nodded. And how do you know that the rocks are that old? What did you say? 2.7 billion years? No way, it wasn't possible. Not only had his eyes not glazed over, as most non-geologists did by this point, but he was asking good fundamental science questions, the kind that she knew her professors expected, or rather hoped to hear from geology undergrads, but rarely did. As she was about to answer, the waitress came by to take their order, or rather his order, as she already had a beer in front of her. Hey, Tom, the waitress greeted him congenially. Agnes, what can I get you? He leaned toward Samina. What would you like? Oh, nothing, thanks. I'm fine with this, she replied, taking hold of her beer bottle and raising it slightly. Do you like lager and lime? I don't know what that is, she mumbled, feeling a little embarrassed at her ignorance. The waitress stepped in. You add lime juice to beer, but here we add lime cordial instead. It tastes better. He was about to add that in his experience most women liked it. It definitely wasn't something that he'd order for himself. Nothing could beat straight Rickards. But he refrained. He wasn't sure if she was the type who took offense at generalizations about women. He suspected that she might be. She was about to decline again, but decided that actually she wouldn't mind some more beer. All right, she agreed with a nod and a slight smile. Good, he replied, smiling back. Turning to the waitress, he said, A pitcher of lager and lime, please, Agnes. Maybe make it with Upper Canada lager. A pitcher, Samina exclaimed, raising her brows as the waitress nodded and turned to leave. Don't worry, I'm having some too, he said. But not much, he thought to himself. I want to see what you're like when you loosen up. Though his interest in geology had appeared to be genuine, she still had a nagging suspicion that he might be feigning it in order to curry favor with her. Though why he would bother with her when he could likely win over any unattached woman in the room, many of whom were much prettier than she was, including the redhead, was a puzzle. Perhaps her interest in him, which he had clearly discerned, was the attraction. There was a simple test. Would he recall the query with which their conversation had ended prior to the interruption by the waitress? So you've never had a lager and lime before? Aha, just as she suspected. He hadn't been all that interested in the answer to the question he'd posed. No, I'm not much of a drinker. That's probably a good thing. We see a lot of accidents around here involving drunk drivers. Yeah, in Toronto too. She paused and then added with a wry grin. But my drinking habits have changed a lot since I got here. It's hard to get respect from male geologists if you don't consume your fair share of beer at the end of a field day, and all the ones I'm working with are male. He laughed. Yeah, I can see that. They were silent. Then he piped up. You were going to tell me how they can tell that the rocks around here are 2.7 billion years old. That he recalled the question frankly surprised her. She couldn't help but smile as she elaborated. We use a mineral called zircon. When it forms, it incorporates uranium into it. Uranium is radioactive and decays to lead at a set rate. The older the zircon, the more uranium will have decayed, and the more lead there'll be in the zircon compared to uranium. Basically, we use the ratio of lead to uranium in the zircon to determine when it formed. If it formed at the same time that the rock that contains it did, then we get the age of the rock too. Wow, that's amazing. She nodded. Yeah, it is, isn't it? She proceeded to reward him for his interest by sharing other interesting tidbits of geological information with him. In the meantime, the waitress returned with their beer. She offered to split the cost with him, but he informed her that this wasn't Toronto, neatly conveying both his distaste for Toronto and his rejection of her offer at the same time. She told him the latest theory about the formation of the moon, that it was a chunk which had been knocked off the Earth early in its history, about the cause of the demise of the dinosaurs, namely a 10-kilometer wide meteor striking the Earth near present-day Mexico 65 million years ago, and other topics that fascinated her. Not only did his eyes remain unglazed, but he continued to ask interesting questions. She wondered what he did for a living, and was about to ask him when he turned and glanced towards the dance floor. "Want to dance?" he asked with a smile, turning back to her. She lowered her eyes and shook her head. "No thanks," she mumbled. She took a quick peek at him to gauge his reaction. He looked disappointed, concerned lest he have the impression that it was him she didn't want to dance with. "Nothing could be further from the truth," she explained. "I'm a terrible dancer." "Really? You probably think about it too much." The song that was currently playing ended. He cocked his head to one side and listened for the next song. It was a slow one. "Come on," he said, standing up and extending his hand. "This is a slow dance. You don't have to do anything except hang on to your partner." She glanced up at him doubtingly. He was certainly making it difficult to refuse. "All right," she nodded reluctantly. She picked up her purse, placed her hand in his, and let him lead her to the dance floor. When they reached it, he turned and faced her. The significant difference in their heights was suddenly apparent. She found herself staring at his collarbone. She slipped her purse over her head and positioned it to the back so that it was hanging off one shoulder. Then she looked up at him, feeling very, very nervous. There it was again, that little smile that conveyed that he was aware of just what she was feeling. His arms circled her, one coming to rest on her upper back, the other at the hollow at its base. She reached up and tentatively placed her hands on his shoulders. There was air between them, which was good, she decided, as her heart rate had now accelerated to alarming proportions. He held her lightly, but she could still feel the pressure of his fingertips on her back. Like Wolverine, he exuded strength, his size, and also the feel of his muscled arms and shoulders under his shirt. As the song wore on, he gradually drew her in, closer and closer, until finally she was pressed right in against him. Not wanting to poke him in the chest with her chin, she turned her head. She could feel the powerful beat of his heart against her cheek. Her arms naturally slid up higher and wound around his neck. He leaned down and rested his cheek against her hair. She found it both dreamy and nerve-wracking to be dancing like this within Wolverine's embrace. Although it was now physically impossible for them to get any closer, his grip on her continued to tighten like a vice, until finally she couldn't help but squirm. After all, she had to breathe. He loosened his hold and, chuckling, inquired, "Am I holding you too tightly?" "Yeah, a bit," she replied with a nervous giggle. "Sorry." The song ended and they parted. He reached out and took a light hold of her hand. As she looked up at him again, he smiled at her, but the nature of the smile had changed. The hint of amusement that it had held earlier had disappeared. It was now a genuine one. She smiled back. The next song started, and she noted with regret that it wasn't a slow one. She'd come to concur that slow dancing really was a matter of simply hanging on to one's partner. "I don't dance to fast songs," she mumbled apologetically, and turned to head back to her table. His grip on her hand tightened, and he stopped her. "Come on, we'll just pretend it's a slow one," he said, and led her to the back of the dance floor. She frowned and shook her head, but couldn't help a slight smile at the same time. They came together, close together. Lacking any sense of rhythm herself, she found it impressive that he would manage to find an underlying slow beat in the fast songs that followed, which still allowed them to dance in time to the music. Meanwhile, his hands became increasingly more adventurous, roaming all over her back while continuing to press her in firmly against him. She noted with relief, however, that as they would approach the invisible barrier at the hollow at the base of her back, they would either only risk crossing it slightly or migrate back up. At the same time, he had begun to lightly nuzzle her hair. They must have spent close to 3/4 of an hour on the dance floor when he whispered in her ear, Want to go outside?" She tensed, a little startled at the request. Her experience with men was appallingly limited, but she had an inkling as to what this meant. Wolverine wanted to neck with her. Part of her was too nervous to accede to his invitation. Was that double or triple time that her heart was now keeping? But another part, the one under the sway of the novel and powerful feelings that he'd aroused in her, leapt at the idea. "All right," she whispered, giving him an anxious look. He took a firm grip of her hand and led her towards the door. She noticed several people at his table turn and look at them as they passed by, most with amused grins on their faces. Her eyes happened to fall on the redhead, who was sitting in the background. She peered at them through narrowed eyes. It seemed that the humor in their situation that was apparent to his friends had eluded her. Once outside, he led her quickly and silently down the steps and to the side of the building. An amorous couple had already taken up station there. He hurriedly led her to the other side. The same result. "Damn," he muttered. The Bear Paw and its parking lot were housed within a more or less circular clearing that was ringed by a line of trees. "Let's go into the woods," he suggested. She immediately tensed. He sensed it. "You can trust me," he murmured, though the roguish smile which accompanied that claim wasn't exactly reassuring. She knew that there was no way that she should be heading into the bush with a relative stranger, but as she gazed searchingly into his eyes, she decided that she did trust him. "All right," she whispered. "Good. Come on," he said, beaming. He didn't take her in far, just enough that they were in shadow. He took hold of both her hands and brought her round so that her back was against a tree. Stroking her knuckles with his thumbs, he stepped towards her, leaned down, and softly kissed her. The feel of his lips against hers was delicious. She wanted more. She went up on tiptoe to meet him, and her arms gradually circled his neck, just as they had when they'd been dancing. Taking this as a sign that he was allowed to go further, his hands went to her waist. Gripping it firmly, he traced his tongue along her lips, before slipping it into her mouth. The sensation was electric, like nothing that she had ever felt before. She moaned. His breathing was now audible, as was hers. As he continued to kiss her, vigorously and unrestrainedly now, his hands began to roam. But unlike the dance floor, out here in the woods, it seemed that all barriers had been removed. He touched her everywhere, in places which no man had ever touched her before, eliciting more moans. She was wearing a silk retro dress that she'd purchased from a second-hand shop. It had large cloth-covered buttons down the front. He began to undo the buttons. Her hand caught his. She knew that she should stop him, but there was a problem. She didn't want to. She released his hand, and when he was done, the two sides of her dress hung open. He slipped his hands underneath and gripped her waist, his touch warm against her skin. Then he bent down and nipped at her breast through her bra. She anticipated that he might try to push it up, but he didn't. He continued his descent, kneeling down and kissing her midriff, her navel, and then startling her by continuing lower. She gasped but didn't protest. And then, before she could stop him, he hooked his thumbs into the edge of her underwear and slid it down off her. She cried out in shock and was about to bend down and pull it back up when the most pleasurable sensation that she had ever experienced in her life licked through her. She knew what was happening. She had heard of it, read about it, seen it in the movies, but never had she experienced anything like it. His tongue was a delightful instrument, effectively bypassing all her efforts at self-preservation and drowning her in a sea of pure pleasure. Her hands were slightly behind her, tightly gripping the tree. As he continued to work his magic, or at least that's what it felt like to her, they reached for him, her fingers raking through his hair and clutching at it, and she soon found herself moving against the tree. "Oh, Tom," she moaned blissfully. He stood up and whispered against her hair, "Want to turn around?" While she was knowledgeable in many areas, her background, her upbringing, and her lack of experience with the opposite sex had all conspired to leave her woefully ignorant in this one. She gazed at him, clueless as to the implications of his request. Feeling as if under the influence of a potent drug, her thoughts in a complete muddle, she nodded robotically and turned and faced the tree. His hands went to her waist to assist her. As she waited for his next move, she heard some shuffling and then, oh damn, no safes. A light suddenly shone through the haze her brain was operating in. Her eyes widened in wonder and she turned and faced him. As her gaze met his, he murmured reassuringly, "I'm sure I have some in the truck." Her brows creased, and she glanced down fearfully. She saw that his jeans and underwear were pushed down, so that they were straddling his thighs. In their place was an object that was both alarming and fascinating. She was taken aback by its prominence. Its stance couldn't exactly be described as menacing, but it was certainly aggressive. It was pointed straight at her. Just as she knew that the Earth's outer core was liquid, without ever having observed it, she was well aware of the existence of such objects, without ever having seen one before, on a grown man, that is, and certainly not in its present state. While she had no aspirations to ever actually observe the core, she had aspired to view such an object at some point in her future, but not tonight, not now. She turned shocked eyes from the astonishing-looking appendage to him. The look in her eyes could not be mistaken. "Oh, shit," he muttered. "Did I misunderstand?" A choked sound escaped her. Frowning and shaking her head, she quickly bent down and pulled up her underwear. Then she grabbed her purse, slung it over her shoulder, and ran towards the bear paw, doing up the buttons on her dress along the way. I'm sorry," he cried after her, pulling up his underwear and jeans. He wanted to stop her, but he couldn't get the damn zipper up. He cursed his choice of jeans for the night. They were one of the tighter pairs that he owned. He sighed, instructing himself to relax. When he'd finally managed to put himself together, he walked slowly back to the bear paw. Along the way, he shook his head with wonder over his behavior tonight. It had been years since he'd tried anything like that, met a woman and dragged her off into the bush, hoping for sex. It wasn't that he had anything against intimacy on first acquaintance, but his practice was to invite the woman to his place, or go to hers. But then he couldn't remember the last time that he had been so powerfully attracted to a woman. He hadn't wanted to wait. He'd wanted her immediately. He wished he'd behaved better with her. He liked her. He really did. In fact, he could see himself falling in love with her. He consoled himself with the thought that it was probably for the best that nothing had happened. After all, she'd be returning to Toronto by the end of the summer, and if they did end up getting close, then where would he be? It made perfect sense. He should feel better about how things had turned out. So why didn't he? When she arrived at the door to the bear paw, she quickly rushed in. She saw a few heads turn in her direction. She immediately glanced down to check that she hadn't left any buttons undone. Then she raked her fingers through her hair, straightening it out, and walked slowly and deliberately back to her table. Along the way, she noticed that the eyes of the redhead were on her. She quickly downed the remaining beer in her glass and poured herself another. She knew she should leave, but felt too dazed to, so she sat, staring at her glass, attempting to recover from what had happened, or nearly happened, out there. When Tom entered the bear paw, he was relieved to see her back at her table. He wanted to talk to her, to explain. He walked over to her table and took up his former spot. She kept her eyes glued to her glass. "I'm sorry, I really am," he murmured. "It's just that I thought you—" She couldn't bring herself to look at him, but frowned and nodded vigorously as if keen to curtail the discussion. He didn't pursue the topic any further. Instead, he sat silently and kept her company, hoping that she'd eventually talk to him, but she didn't. Not only that, but she didn't move at all, just sat frozen, staring at her glass. Perhaps she'd feel better if he left. "Do you want me to leave?" he asked, eyeing her with concern. Of all the questions, why did he have to ask her that one? She couldn't have said yes to anyone for fear of hurting their feelings, and it was only her extreme shock and high embarrassment that was preventing her from speaking to him at the moment, a significant part of that comprising astonishment at herself for how far she had allowed him to go. No, she wasn't upset at him. She believed him when he said that he'd been mistaken about her wishes, but at the same time, she couldn't say no. She felt too shy to. It would have been akin to encouraging him, and she wasn't sure that she could look him in the eyes right now and carry on a conversation, given what had just happened. She shrugged. He took it as a yes. He stood up reluctantly. "Okay, bye," he murmured. "Bye," she replied, finally looking at him. He smiled his relief that she was still willing to talk to him, even if it was just to say goodbye. He reached inside his jeans pocket, brought out his wallet, and pulled out a card. Handing it to her, he said, his amused grin back in place, "And if the locals get out of hand, do something that annoys you, you can always give me a call." She glanced at the card. It indicated that he worked for the Ontario Provincial Police. "You're an OPP officer?" she cried, with a touch of dismay. He couldn't understand why people had to say it like that, particularly the educated, progressive types, as if he was afflicted with some odious disease, rather than doing a job that needed to be done. She wouldn't have been able to do it. Why couldn't she and others appreciate that? "Yes," he replied, feeling annoyed with her now. And then he did something that he hated doing, namely justifying what he did for a living. "I have a master's in criminology from SFU, you know." Oh, that she uttered the latter in a mollified tone did nothing to lessen his annoyance. "Well, goodbye," he said curtly, and turned and walked away. "Bye," she whispered to his retreating back. She watched him as he proceeded to his table. She wasn't the only one. She could see the redhead's eyes on him as well. A couple of the men at his table spoke to him after he sat down. They were laughing and seemed to be joking with him, but he was having none of it, appearing irritated. They looked over at her. She glanced down, feeling acutely embarrassed. When she dared to peek again, she saw the redhead lean over and say something to him. He nodded, and they began to talk, but there was none of the joviality that there had been during their earlier conversation, at least on his side. She was still smiling, but later she saw him relax and start to smile again. After approximately half an hour, they got up. She thought that they were again headed to the dance floor, and wondered if this might not be the time to take a trip to the ladies' room and get out of their way, but instead they walked towards the door. His hand was on her back. Why did she have this strange feeling, as if the pit of her stomach had fallen away? When they reached the door, he held it open for the redhead, but before he stepped through it, he turned and looked back at her. Their gazes met. It was difficult to read his expression. He looked somber, apologetic. She quickly looked down. When she glanced up again, the door had closed, and they were gone. "So that's how it works around here," she thought with chagrin. "You try your luck with one woman, and if that doesn't work out, you move on to the next." She spotted them through the window, heading towards the parking lot, and saw them getting into a truck. The truck's headlights went on, and it pulled out. At least he was bothering to take this one home, she thought wryly. She finished her beer and considered pouring herself another glass, but decided against it. She would only have had it because she hated to waste food, but there was too much left to finish on her own. He had had very little, no more than a glass it seemed. His unfinished glass still sat on the table. In a sort of toast to her grand adventure with Wolverine, in the bush no less, she slid her glass towards his until it clinked. Too bad it hadn't been one that she could tell her parents or her kids about. For some reason she was beset by this irrational feeling that he'd abandoned her. She no longer felt like staying. She quickly picked up her purse and jacket and headed towards the door, making sure to avoid eye contact with those at his former table along the way. When she arrived back at the cabin, it was close to 1 a.m. While it was her and Chris's day off tomorrow, Grant and Phil would be working. Even Chris would be waking up early, as he'd been commissioned to take Grant's van into Dryden to get it checked out. She felt guilty for disturbing them, but then recalled that Chris and Phil had woken her up after their last outing to Dryden. They'd gone there again tonight, but were back because the van was parked outside. She wondered what time they'd returned. It was pitch black in the cabin. She had no choice but to switch the light on in the large main room that she entered. Her own bedroom was adjoined to it, but fortunately the two bedrooms that Grant and the boys occupied were separated from it by a short hallway. But even then, as soon as the light went on, she heard some coughing. She recognized the voice, Grant. From then on, it seemed that each significant step in her preparation for bed tickled Grant's throat. She entered the bathroom, a cough. She exited the bathroom, another cough. She got herself a bottle of water, yet another cough. She entered her room, cough, cough. Unable to withhold her irritation any longer, before shutting the door to her room, she said loudly, "Are you up, Grant?" "I wasn't, but I am now," came the bone-dry reply. She rolled her eyes. For the next few days she was periodically reminded of her lack of consideration for the other members of the team. She was also asked to recall the purpose of her stay in Ignace, namely to do geology and not to have fun. There she would have to disagree with him, she informed Grant, pointing out that there were few activities that she had as much fun doing as geology. Finally, at her wits' end from his incessant needling, she asked him what time he would like her to be home by. She was told midnight, at the latest, though others on the team might appreciate her presence earlier. She ignored the addendum and vowed that for the rest of the field season, never, ever would she break curfew again. Thanks for listening, and your comments either way would be really appreciated. Thanks.